Today, we're jumping right into something that's at the very heart of the Mandarin language, the Mandarin Tone Challenge. If you've ever tried to learn Mandarin, you already know that tones can be, well, a little tricky. Let's really dig into why they're so important.
So, let me ask you a question that might sound a little weird. Can a pig and a person sound the same? In Mandarin, the answer is, well, it's surprisingly close. A tiny, tiny shift in the pitch of your voice is all that separates them. Stick around and you'll hear exactly what I mean.
All right, here's our game plan for today. First up, we'll talk about why tones matter so much. Then, we're going to put your ears to the test with a two-part challenge. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a key takeaway for your own language journey.
So, let's start with part one. Why do we even need to worry about tones? You know, in English, the pitch of our voice adds emotion, right? You can sound excited or maybe a little sarcastic. But in Mandarin, it's a completely different story.
And that's really the key. In Mandarin, the tone isn't just optional flavor you add on top. If you change the tone, you literally change the meaning of the word. It's not about sounding different, it's about saying a different word entirely. So mastering tones, it's absolutely non-negotiable if you want to be understood.
Okay, now for the fun part. It's time to train your ears. I'm going to play a sentence, and I want you to listen really carefully for a key phrase inside of it. Ready? Let's give it a go. Okay, here's the full sentence. It means this movie is so-so. The key part is right at the end. Listen closely to that last bit. Now let's see what happens when we make just one tiny change to the tone.
So, the phrase you just heard was yi ban. Did you catch how both syllables were spoken in a high, flat tone? That means so-so. But if we just change the second syllable to a rising tone, it becomes yi ban. And just like that, it means half. You've gone from giving an opinion about a movie to talking about a fraction, all with a simple change in pitch.
All right, here we go with the next one. This sentence means it's a bit noisy here. The word to really focus on is chao. Listen for that sound. This is where it gets really subtle. The word chao means noisy, but if you just change that dipping and rising tone to one that only rises, it becomes chao, and that means humid. In just one syllable, you've gone from talking about the noise to talking about the weather. Here's a really practical one. This sentence says, I will go to his house tomorrow to repay the money. Pay very close attention to those last two words.
And this is a perfect example of how high the stakes can be. The sentence uses huan tian with that rising tone, which means to repay a debt. But if you use a falling tone instead, huan tian, it means to exchange currency. A simple mistake here could lead to a very awkward conversation about money.
You're doing great. So let's move on to the second part of our challenge. We've got a few more pairs to really help sharpen those listening skills. Ready for round two?
Okay, let's work through these one by one. First, if you want to buy a speaker, you say yinxiang. You have to be careful not to say yingxiang because that means influence. Next, imagine you're describing the local people. The word is tutsu, meaning indigenous. A tiny mistake in tone, and you might say tutsu, which means local pig. And, that's a pretty big difference. And finally, if you admire someone, the word is xianmu. That sounds very different to a native speaker than xiangmu, which means a project. See how important this is.
Okay, the next example we're going to cover is, well, it's maybe the most important one of all. Getting this one wrong can take you from being respectful to being extremely rude in an instant. So please listen very, very carefully to this one.
This sentence translates to, my grandmother passed away last month. The key phrase here, which is said with respect, is kushi.
Let's break this down very carefully. The correct, respectful phrase is 去世. Notice both words are said with a falling tone. It means to pass away. But if you only change the tone of the second word, it becomes 去死, and that means go die. The difference is just enormous, and it all comes down to one small shift in your pitch.
And just so we are all perfectly clear, 去死 is an extremely rude thing to say. It's something you might hear when someone is really, really angry, so this is an absolutely essential cultural note to remember.
Okay, let's wrap up our challenge with these final three pairs. Listen closely. First, we have nuli, which means slave, versus nuli, which means work hard. Second, there's ziyuan, meaning a resource, compared to ziyuan, meaning voluntary.
And for our last one, you could be going to the 超市, the supermarket, or you could be talking about how it's 超市, which means humid. I'll say them all one more time. 努力, 努力, 洗碗, 洗碗, 超市, 超市.
So, after all that listening, what's the big takeaway? What's the main thing you should remember from our session today?
It really just boils down to these three simple ideas. First, in Mandarin, tone is meaning. It's not an extra. Second, a small change in your pitch doesn't just modify a word, it creates a brand new one. And third, this means that training your ear to actually hear these differences is just as important as memorizing new words.
And that leaves me with one final thought for you. Think about your own native language for a second. What's the smallest, most subtle difference in sound, maybe a vowel or a consonant, that can completely change the meaning of a word? It's a really interesting way to think about how all languages work. Thanks for joining me today.